I felt like lying down by the side of the trail and remembering it all. The woods do that to you. They always look familiar, long lost, like the face of a long dead relative, like an old dream, like a piece of forgotten song drifting across the water. Most of all, like golden entities of past childhood or past manhood, and all of the living and all of the dying and the heartbreak that went on 1,000,000 years ago, and the clouds as they pass overhead seem to testify by their own lonesome familiarity to this feeling. Dharma Bums, Jack Kerouac. And yes, folks, you have entered the realm of Radio Tipping Point. My name is Mike Boyle, and our show today is titled The Solitude of Estrangement. And this word solitude, I've come to the realization it's kind of a funny word. First off, I have not been able to find a proper definition or translation, better said, of this word solitude in German. All I do is come up with loneliness. Yes, that's what I come up with. But solitude is something much different to me. I don't think it's necessarily a German phenomenon. That in preparation for the show today, I found disparate definitions, and I suspect because this feeling that's generated can take on different forms, and they are perhaps not always positive. And so therefore, we struggle as human beings to define these things based on our dualistic nature. We're either happy or sad. We can't be both at the same time, of course. No, we can't. And that very well could be the reason why we struggle with a proper definition. But regardless, we will do our best to cover this in the next 55 minutes, 54 minutes. And I'd like to start with my impetus, why this subject is so important to me. And I think I have to go way, 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 way back. Especially if you are continuously reminded that you look at things differently, and that very often happens at a very early age. That you end up in a situation, sometimes by choice, sometimes by happenstance, sometimes by necessity, and I think we will be covering all three in some fashion in the realm of the show. Well, because I never really felt in sync with most of my age, I was very often on my own. And to a certain degree, that felt like a safe space, being on my own. You save yourself being ostracized. And so that feeling became quite normal. And I think there are different realizations that I went through. Part of it I only really understood much later. But the striving towards autonomy and mastery, which was very strong for me, I think, pretty much from day one. But that doesn't necessarily fit into the model that we have of someone who's a teenager, because the last thing you want to do is stick out. And so you become very conscious. You become conscious of things that actually sometimes there, but then you build them up. And in essence, for the most part, people don't care, but we keep thinking that they're looking at us all the time. And I can remember one trip I took. This was when I was 18, getting ready to go to university, which was outside of where I grew up. And so I drove down for the day, and so I needed to get something to eat. So I went into this restaurant by the side of the road, and I felt extremely self-conscious. And so I felt, well, maybe I should buy a newspaper so that I seem less conspicuous. In other words, I'm doing something instead of just being there. And this, of course, was long before the days of the internet and mobile phone. But I wonder if that feeling, the feeling that I had back then, is one that people often have. They feel that they need to appear to be occupied, because if you are not occupied, then it seems strange. That's this picture we have in our head. And I think that was the feeling that I had back then. And being the recalcitrant became much easier the older I got, because I realized that I was freed of the shackles of teenagerdom. And I had already known that I was picking the more difficult path, better said. But that was a conscious decision. And relishing in that decision that we make. And the key element of that sentence is the decision part, because very often we will let circumstances decide it for us. But we do have a choice. And so as I continued on my path, very often I would, when I started going to concerts, I would buy 2 tickets and then look to see if there was somebody else who wanted to come along. And that became a major effort. And after a while, I decided, what's the point? Why do I feel that I need to have somebody there where they might like it or they don't like it? I feel a certain responsibility. And so I freed myself at a very early age, or I consider to be an early age. And so then I decided I'm just going to buy 1 ticket. I'm not even going to bother asking anyone. And if for some reason I found out that somebody else was going, well, then we can get together, which actually never happened. And that all became quite normal. And I continued with this attitude and traveling very often on my own, because I felt that it allowed for me to have the freedom to immerse myself in whatever situation I found myself to be. It allowed for me to meet people that I probably would never meet otherwise. It allowed for me to put myself in situations where sometimes very challenging. But I know that I would have never gotten to that point had I a different way of looking at all of this. And so within that mindset, the mindset that I developed, there were plenty of opportunities for me to relish in whatever was taking place around me. And that allowed me to appreciate this feeling of solitude that I questioned whether I would have been able to actually reach that point under other circumstances. And so, what is this term, solitude? And in preparation for the show, I looked to see how can it be defined. And interesting, I think the different types of definition are very indicative of how disparate this word is actually interpreted. So the first one, which would be an obvious one, that would be physical isolation. So you are removed from others. You have put yourself in a place where there's nobody else there. That does not mean that you are alone. Just because we do not have human beings around us does not mean that we are by our lonesome. No. We have nature. We have the other living creatures on this planet that are with us. And I found that it gave me an opportunity just to relish in watching how they manage things. And obviously, if you're talking to somebody or if you're occupied in some fashion, then this all kind of goes on and you're not very cognizant. And I can remember times sitting on the beach with nobody there, watching the waves, watching the other living beings that were to be found in the area, and relishing in just being there, right? Just being there. So there are a number of people, and I suspect a number of you might be thinking, well, that's not a very good situation to be removed from everybody else. In this particular case, it was a cognitive decision that I made, and we'll come up with an example of perhaps maybe that decision is not always made by the individual, and how do you deal with it? And how do you turn solitude to your benefit? Now, the second definition I came up with has very strong negative connotations. Emotional seclusion. That one sounds like loneliness to me. And in fact, when I look at the other elements that are found within this definition, solitude can also describe a mental or emotional state where an individual feels isolated, even in the presence of others. That's clearly loneliness. That would not be solitude for me. It goes beyond physical separation to encompass a sense of emotional or psychological aloneness. Well, there you have it. So up till now, this isn't a very positive feeling I'm getting from these definitions. So let's continue, right? Intentional retreat. Okay, I think we're getting a little bit closer here. Solitude can be a deliberate choice to withdraw from social interactions and external stimuli. I'm not really too crazy about this definition either, because it's not escape. It is relishing in the fact that you don't need to have somebody around you to be occupied. You do not need to have somebody around you to establish some sort of identity. You don't need to have somebody around you to feel fulfilled and to feel aware of yourself, to feel aware of your surroundings. So again, I question this definition as well. This intentional retreat allows for self-reflection. Okay, I'm all right with that one. Introspection, yes, and personal renewal away from the demands of social life. Yeah, okay. I think the fourth definition leads us in a much better realm. Spiritual contemplation. In a spiritual or philosophical context, solitude may involve seeking a deeper connection with oneself on a higher power. It can be a purposeful time for meditation, prayer, or contemplation to achieve spiritual growth and understanding. There, I think we're getting a little bit closer to the plan. Let me give you the last definition. Creative seclusion. Solitude can be a conducive environment for creative pursuits. Artists, writers, and thinkers often seek solitude to foster concentration, inspiration, and the uninterrupted exploration of their craft. In this sense, solitude becomes a fertile ground for creative expression. And so you could see from those 5 definitions that I just gave you that we're covering various types of emotional states. We're covering different impetus for either striving for that state or contemplating within that state. And that means for us as human beings that we can move from something very positive, something very fulfilling, to something that would be considered quite isolating. So if that is solitude, encompassing all of those definitions, then what would be the polar opposite of solitude? And I think this was truly the impetus for me to talk about the subject in the show, because I think that this is a serious problem, because we know that loneliness does not mean that you're isolated from other human beings. Going back to definition, which one was it? Definition number 1, physical isolation or emotional seclusion. I think that they're somewhat the same side of the coin. But the opposite is truly that state that we find ourselves to be, the nation of sheep ruled by wolves, owned by pigs. So why do I say that? Because that's a very strong statement. Within that statement, ruled by wolves, owned by pigs, and we are the sheep, that infers there is a certain acquiescence that's taking place, that we allowed for this to happen. This is a state that perhaps we might not necessarily relish, but it's comfortable for us. It brings a certain amount of certainty. And we all know that one of our biggest fear is the unknown. And I'm surprised we don't all go to bed with our nightlights on. Perhaps maybe most people do. I've never taken a tour through the neighborhood to see who actually has the nightlight on or not. But in that fear of the unknown, you could very well imagine that our emotional security blanket can take on various forms. And we all know from a political perspective where it's led us, because we have a very strong trend of politicians that are going to tell us what we think we want to hear. Doesn't mean that it's obtainable, but that doesn't matter. It's that false sense of security. And even if we end up with totally different results, the thing that bothers us the most is not knowing how things can turn out. And so we take yesterday's newspaper and use it as a benchmark to predict tomorrow. Although these things have absolutely nothing to do with each other. And so the real fear is being alone. And that aloneness can take on different forms. And interestingly enough, when I think about those first two definitions that I gave you, they're very predominant here. That means that physical isolation, that we are afraid that something bad's going to happen to us. We do not feel that we have agency. That sense of empowerment is very often lacking. We do not feel that we are equipped to manage whatever situation that might come our way. We, more than ever, are deathly afraid of being in a situation where we don't have the proper manual to get us through it, instead of having a trust in our natural wherewithal. And that the situation is primarily built up in our heads. And that so-called danger is more or less something that's been built up. Just like our needs are primarily perceived, that danger very often is tied to that reaction that we don't know that's going to come out of us. And so that leads us to a collection of friends that I would call a shallow pond. And so within a shallow pond, you would have plenty of water, but it's not very deep. Which means it's a friendship of convenience. The ability to hold that friendship regardless of whatever twists and turns that we might take or they might take seems to be a lost art form. But the fact is that we all develop, whether we like it or not. And that means that we might not always be in alignment. And that's something that really bothers us. So the friendship ends up being like a suit that you decide doesn't really fit you anymore, so you will discard of it. And then you're finished, right? My fault, my failure is not in the passions I have, but in my lack of control of them. Dharma Bums, Jack Kerouac. Welcome to the realm of Radio Tipping Point. You have entered our latest rendition titled The Solitude of Estrangement. My name is Mike Boyle. And within those definitions that I gave earlier, within that physical, primarily the physical and emotional isolation, we know there are conditions where we are put into that state on purpose. Incarceration is the best example. But of course, incarceration or being locked up takes on different forms. And so I'd like to stay with this concept of solitude and perform a little bit of a mashup. I'm not quite sure how this is going to turn out, but that's usually the case on the show. In this mashup that I would like to put together would be taking Alexei Navalny and Viktor Frankl. So perhaps let's start with Frankl. And for those of you who are not familiar with truly a seminal book, Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl was in concentration camp, survived, and he talks about how he focuses on meaning, how he defines meaning for himself, which was an absolute necessity for him to survive. Now, in Frankl's particular case, there would be less of a physical isolation. He's with other people, although one can argue it's a collection of individuals that need to go into their own being to figure out how they get past the situation. Sometimes they are put into competition. Sometimes there's cooperation. Sometimes that's all happening at the same time. And Frankl talks about the condition of the others and how he is able to recognize very quickly who has given up. And you can very well imagine for the individual that would be very discouraging, because you see those people to the left and right of you and they're folding and you don't want to fold. So how do you ensure that doesn't happen? And so Frankl goes on to talk about very small things that he's observing that reminds him that there's hope, reminds him that there's meaning out there in spite of everything that he's getting day in and day out. And so I would define that search for meaning that Frankl describes as a component of solitude. Why? Because he has defined his own environment. He has looked for beauty where there is no beauty. He has looked for hope where there's no hope. He has looked for wonder where there's only despair. And I believe that a lot of those elements, those that I just described, can and probably apply to Navalny. And just to make sure we're all on the same page, opposition leader Alexei Navalny of Russia, who is the recipient of a continuous onslaught coming from Vladimir Putin and his henchmen. And especially after the poisoning attack, where he was flown to Germany, which allowed for him to stay alive, that he would make a conscious decision to go back because he felt that was his responsibility, which for me personally seems completely amazing. I really question to what degree I could ever have that strength. I would have said, okay, I did as best I can. Let's wait until the dust settles and perhaps I can come back later on. But he understood that's not him. and he was not interested in making a compromise to himself. I never thought of that before, but that's truly what it is. He did not want to make a compromise to himself, so he was willing to live with the consequences, knowing full well that he would be immediately arrested as soon as he arrived onto Russian soil. And we see that Navalny's health is deteriorating, that Putin and co. are doing their best to ruin Navalny. But Navalny does not seem to falter. And so basically Navalny has created his own condition, a condition that he freely chose, understanding that those consequences and that very possibly his body might give in, but he refuses to give them his mind, right? He refuses to give them his mind. And you see that every time when a report comes through that he's as feisty as ever. So do you see a similarity between what Frankl went through and how he was able to keep his mental wits and those techniques that Navalny is using And I believe that those two examples are some of the best that I could think of the power of solitude. Because that aloneness or that being separate can be a free choice. But the point is, it doesn't matter. It's a condition, it's a mindset. And here we have two examples of individuals who are able to transcend their situation. And that goes back to the point that we do have a choice, that we do not need to be sheep. We don't need to be ruled by wolves. And we certainly don't need to be owned by pigs. We have a choice. And so if we accept that, that was our choice. That was our choice. And we have plenty of examples of how that condition can be avoided. But of course, the difficult part is that we often do not feel that we are strong enough. We do not feel that we are equipped enough to make that one happen. And we're terribly afraid of the unknown. Not realizing that very often we define our own sufficiency. And within that journey that I've been taking, and especially in preparation for the show, I started talking to different people about the subject and always got a funny reaction, which was not a deterrent, as you can see. It spurred me on to take the dive without the life vest. And there was another element that I saw was closely aligned with this concept of solitude and this feeling of awe. And I think about those times where I relished in that condition of solitude that I found myself to be in, that allowed me to take in all of those things that are around me in a way that I wouldn't have been able to otherwise, because either I was with somebody else and then our focus is on the others, or tied to activities, because we often bombard ourselves with tasks with the real fear that we might get to the point of where we have nothing to do. And it would be a lie if I said I was never in that situation. And I think that's the reason why I can talk about it and profess that it's really not that bad. Quite the opposite. In fact, if you're able to turn it around and allow for you to be awestruck from those things that are around you in whatever form they may take, could be the interaction between different human beings, can be in the beauty of nature, in the formation of birds, in the ripples of the water, in the formation of the trees, and the interaction between all of these components in a way that we try to control as human beings. Fruitlessly, and we see the results. Instead of just sitting back and relishing in its splendor, and that leads me to a term that I call emergent reflection. Let me see how I do in describing this one. Let's start with a general definition of reflection. That means that you stop whatever the activities are that you have been performing with a clear purpose. That's to take a step back and understand what has been transpiring. And they can take on different forms, perhaps a reaction of others, maybe the situation per se. And I think very often it's, how do you deal with your own reaction? Or at least for me. And so by taking that step back and performing reflection, not only do you remove yourself from the here and now, but you leave yourself open to perhaps emotions that you didn't know that you have, situations that you were not aware of, possibilities that are there that you were not able to see otherwise. And so I consider all of that to be very emergent. In other words, something that's taking place that you did not plan. You were able to recognize it. You saw that as either an opportunity for new activities, to change the way you look at things, perhaps an inkling of hope that you weren't able to find otherwise. And I wonder, for those two examples that I gave you from Frankl and Navalny, I wonder if they were performing some sort of emergent reflection because they had the time They needed to hold on to some sort of sensitivity, because through that sensitivity, we find our purpose, we find our meaning. And the real challenge is dealing with our sensitivity and those possible emotions that are derived from that openness that we have led ourselves to. Down on the lake, rosy reflections of celestial vapor appeared, and I said, God, I love you, and looked to the sky and really meant it. I have fallen in love with you, God. Take care of us all, one way or the other. To the children and the innocent, it's all the same. Another quote from Dharma Bums from Jack Kerouac. I performed the same exercise as I did with solitude, and I tried to look at different definitions of awe. And that was obviously appeared to be a little bit more consistent. And three of those definitions I'd like to cover right now. One being the overwhelming wonder. Awe can be defined as a powerful and overwhelming sense of wonder or amazement in response to something extraordinary, grand, or transcendent. It involves a feeling of reverence and astonishment at the vastness of beauty of what is observed. And so here I would argue you need to be in the right mind frame to receive all of those emotions, to receive all of those impulses, to contemplate that of what's taking place around you. So they are not always a married pair, but I believe there's a close link between solitude and awe, specifically tied to wonderment. Now, the second one actually shows how closely aligned solitude and awe are. The second definition is mixed emotion of reverence and fear. And I think that one really does describe the difficulty that we have as human beings. On the one side is that sense of wonderness, but that lack of control and the fear that it can dissipate very quickly, and that it leaves us to be very vulnerable. So let's see exactly what the definition was that I came up with. Awe often involves a complex emotional response that combines admiration, reverence, and sometimes a touch of fear or apprehension. It arises when confronted with something that transcends one's ordinary understanding or expectations. Well, that really does close the loop, doesn't it? And so for good measure, let me continue with the third definition that I wanted to share with you. Transcendent experience. Awe is a profound and transcendent experience that can temporarily shift one's perspective, making them feel connected to something greater than themselves. Isn't that beautiful? It often leads to a sense of humility and a reevaluation of one's place in the grand scheme of things. Wow, that one's great. I love that one. So what have we talked about so far? We've talked about the disparate definitions for this term that we call solitude, and I do believe that the second definition of awe falls within that line, the reverence and fear and the vulnerability, which wasn't spoken of, but I think is a major component of the solitude. And we've covered what condition that lack of solitude has actually led us to. Our fear of being alone, it's our fear of not being occupied, it's a fear of being ostracized, it's our fear of doing the wrong thing, the fear of finding out about something about ourselves that we didn't want to know instead of just accepting it. And that fear of something deeper, primarily concentrating on ourselves, because that's the only thing that we can really manage. That's ourselves within the here and now. So I'd like to close the show with those elements that I think could be considered to be a path to lead us to that the appreciation of solitude. There was another word that I thought of that falls in line with that third definition of awe, and that was the question of humility. And the word that hasn't been mentioned so far is that feeling of gratitude. The gratitude that we have for those things that we have, that we either take for granted and I'm not necessarily talking about our personal condition, because that could be very much based upon externalities. I'm referring to maybe our own health, the friends and the relationships that we have, the beauty that is to be found around us. And I would argue that a sense of solitude can lead us to a better feeling of gratitude. And within that path, I think the first element that is very much tied to reflection is that the ability to observe, the observance that's taking place, because you have allowed yourself not to be completely occupied all the time, and you've put all that on pause, and you allow yourself to observe those things that are around you. Which is a basic tenet, not just of performing a meaningful reflection, but allows for that emergence that I referred to, the ability to recognize opportunities, recognize beauty, come up with something truly innovative. And very possibly the gratefulness that you might develop in being that unique individual who you are, which is truly the biggest gift that we can give to each other. So I don't know how linear this is, this path, but I think certainly the ability to be observant is a prerequisite for us to develop a certain sensitivity, because there are conditions that we need to build up for ourselves in order for us to manage the vulnerability that is very much tied to something like sensitivity. And this isn't an on or off switch that you find on the wall when you enter a room. This is something that could be more like a pendulum that we keep going back and forth. Not too dissimilar to that description that I gave you tied to awe, which was both reverence and that sense of fear. I think these two elements are very closely entwined into all of these concepts. But one thing's for sure, without that ability of allowing ourselves to be sensitive of what's taking around us, so that we understand not only those things that are not apparent otherwise, but also our reaction to them. Because it's a combination of both. They don't happen in isolation. That means that you are allowing yourself the ability to be affected by that. That means you are allowing yourself to transcend that invisible wall that we establish. And it means that we are willing to live with the consequences, knowing full well that very possibly we might not be able to manage it properly. We don't know. We're not there yet. And not all situations are the same, right? So that second part of that path for me is that sensitivity that we develop with all the danger that's to be tied to it. And then the last part that I'd like to cover is this idea of mindfulness, which is one that we do talk about quite often. And we understand the necessity that we have as individuals for our own well-being and our ability to be able to allow ourselves to fall into those different states. My personal take is that's not something that happens on its own. It's something that has to be developed. It's something that we have to allow ourselves, with all the possible repercussions, good, bad, and indifferent, that might come out of that. But that's all tied to this free choice that we have, knowing full well that the opposite, the polar opposite, would be tied to being a member of that nation of sheep, where we allow ourselves to be ruled by the wolves instead of actually understanding that we, being unique individuals, have the power, and we don't necessarily need to bequeath that to individuals who do not deserve it, do not have our best interest at heart, and in fact could never really know because they're not us. And then, for whatever interpretation you'd like to take, that system that we have, where we know that it's the system that leads us to these reactions, that these problems are systemic, and that we indeed do have the power on an individual level to affect it. And I did it. We've reached the 2-minute warning, and very often I start on these journeys not really quite sure what's going to be the takeaway, what's going to be the focus, and to what degree what kind of appreciation I have to the subject after spending this time with you and talking about it. Solitude is often the best company and a silent refuge for the soul to rediscover itself. That one came from Charles Bukowski. And I'd like to close with that statement from Bukowski, because what's inferred by his statement? That we are our own best company, right? And that infers that we feel comfortable about ourselves. And that we relish in the fact of being ourselves, right? And I think it's quite interesting that silent refuge probably is an antidote to living within that community of sheep. Being bombarded by the messages, the dictates from the wolves, and just being us. Thanks for listening, and I will be back next week.